My name is Willa Monroe, and I was 33 the day my parents came to my wedding dressed for a funeral. Black dress, black veil, my father in a black suit that still had the store crease in the sleeve. My sister Bryn walked between them with a folder under her arm and a smile she'd been saving all week. The music stopped. 150 guests turned in their chairs. My mother crossed the barn floor, took the microphone off its stand, and said in a voice built for a church, "We can only mourn one daughter today." Then she looked at me in my white dress and said, "We'll stay right here until you sign this house over to your sister." Bryn laughed. My husband set down his glass and stood up. What he put on that screen a minute later is the part none of them saw coming. To understand why my own mother wore black to my wedding, you have to go back to a green metal box under my grandmother's stairs. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where quiet people finally set the record straight and walls built to hide the truth come down in front of everyone. If a family ever made you feel like the strong one who didn't deserve any softness, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Let me back up, because a barn full of stunned wedding guests is not where this story starts. It starts with the kind of person I am, which is a person who checks things 3 times. I'm an emergency room nurse. 12 years of night shifts in a county hospital will teach you to trust your own eyes and nobody's story. When a chart says one thing and a patient's color says another, you learn to believe the color. I catch the small wrong thing before it turns into the big wrong thing. That's the whole job. I was good at it. I just never thought I'd have to do it to my own family. People who meet me say I'm calm. What they mean is I'm quiet. And quiet gets mistaken for a lot of things. In my family, it got mistaken for a door. I lived alone back then, out on Larkin Road, in a farmhouse with cedar closets and a porch that needed paint. I paid for that paint myself, 1 gallon at a time, the same way I'd paid for nursing school and the used truck in the driveway. Nobody handed me anything. I want you to understand that early, because later somebody is going to stand up and tell a whole room that I owed them everything. I didn't. I owed them exactly nothing, and it took me 33 years and a forged signature to finally say so out loud. That night, though, I still believed families settled things quietly. I still believed if you were reasonable, reasonable people would meet you halfway. I was about to find out what my mother thought halfway meant. It meant everything I had, handed over with a smile, in front of witnesses, before anyone could ask the one question that would sink her. The house on Larkin Road was my grandmother's before it was mine. Ruth Monroe raised me in that house more than my own parents ever did. When I was small and the noise at home got to be too much, my father would drive me out to the farm and leave me for a weekend that stretched into a week. Grandma Ruth never once acted like I was a burden dropped on her porch. She taught me to can tomatoes and change a tire and write everything down. "Paper doesn't forget, Willa," she'd say, tapping the old ledger where she tracked every seed and every dollar. "People forget. Paper doesn't." She smelled like cedar and coffee. She kept a green metal box under the stairs that she called her important things box, and she guarded it like it held gold. It held paper. That's all it ever held, and by the end of this story you'll understand that paper was worth more than gold. Grandma died 2 years before my wedding, 81 years old, in her own bed, with me holding her hand through a night shift I'd traded 3 favors to get off. In her will, she left the farmhouse to me, not to the family, not to be split. To me, by name, spelled out by her lawyer and recorded down at the county building where such things get made real. My parents were at the reading. I watched my mother's face when the lawyer said my name, and only my name. She smiled the way you smile at a funeral when you're already thinking about the estate. I didn't understand that smile then. I filed it away, the way I file away a patient's odd little symptom that doesn't fit yet. 2 years later, it would fit. 2 years later, that smile would walk into my wedding wearing a black veil. To understand my family, you have to understand the math of it, and the math never changed. There were 2 daughters. There was one bank of attention, and it all flowed one direction. Bryn was 3 years younger and, in my parents' eyes, 3 years more fragile. When Bryn wanted dance lessons, there was money for dance lessons. When I wanted the same, I was told I was practical, that I didn't need things like that. Practical. That word followed me my whole life like a dog I never fed. It meant, you'll be fine, so we won't worry about you. By the time we were grown, the pattern had a rhythm you could set a clock to. Bryn opened a boutique in town with money my parents scraped together. The boutique failed. Bryn opened another. That one failed too. Each time, my mother's voice on the phone would go soft and urgent, and each time the family would rally around Bryn like she was a house on fire. Nobody ever rallied around me, because I never let anything catch fire. I paid my bills. I showed up for my shifts. I was reliable. And in my family, reliable was just a quieter word for available. Available to be leaned on, borrowed from, and eventually, I'd learn, robbed. I didn't resent Bryn. Not really. You can't resent water for running downhill. I resented that nobody ever asked if I was tired of being the hill. My weakness, if you want to name it, was that I couldn't stop being the one who held things together. I'd fix the problem before anyone thanked me for it. I'd notice the small wrong thing and quietly handle it and never send the bill. That habit is what made me good at my job. It's also what almost cost me the only thing my grandmother ever gave me. Almost. I met Elliot Brandt at a fundraiser for the volunteer fire department, of all places. He taught history at the high school 2 towns over, and he had the calmest hands I'd ever seen on a man who wasn't a surgeon. We dated for 2 years before he asked, and when he asked, he did it on the porch on Larkin Road with the paint I'd finally finished drying behind us. I said yes before he got the whole sentence out. I called my parents the next morning, the way you're supposed to, because I still played by rules nobody else in my family respected. My mother went quiet on the line. Not happy quiet, calculating quiet. Then she said, "That's nice, honey. And what happens to the house?" Not congratulations. Not, "I'm happy for you." The house. I told her the house was mine and would stay mine, and Elliot understood that. And that was the end of it. She said, "We'll see," in the tone she used when she meant the opposite. Then the phone made a muffled sound, like she'd pressed it to her chest, and I heard her call out to my father, and I heard Bryn's name, and I heard a door close. The line came back a minute later, bright and false. "We'll celebrate soon," she said, and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table with the ring still new on my hand, and a cold feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with Elliot. I knew that closed door tone. I'd heard it my whole childhood, always right before something got decided about me without me. I told myself I was reading too much into a phone call. I told myself families get strange around weddings. I was half right. My family didn't get strange around my wedding. They got organized. The first ask came 2 weeks later, over coffee at my mother's kitchen table in town, 20 minutes down the county road from my farm. She'd invited me like it was a treat. She poured the good coffee, the kind she saved for company, which should have been my first warning. Then she folded her hands and told me the family had been talking. In my family, the family has been talking means a decision has already been made, and I'm being informed. She said Bryn was going through a hard stretch. She said it wasn't fair that I had a whole house to myself while my sister struggled. She said, and I'll never forget the softness she wrapped it in, "It would mean so much if you'd think about sharing the farm with your sister, putting her name on it, for family." I set my cup down. I said no. I said it kindly, but I said it clearly. Because 12 years of night shifts teaches you that a clear no now saves everyone a worse conversation later. My mother's face changed like weather. The warmth ran off it. Her eyes filled, right on cue, the way they always did when kindness stopped working and she reached for guilt. "After everything this family has done for you," she said, dabbing at nothing. I asked her, honestly curious, what exactly the family had done for me that I hadn't done for myself. She didn't answer that. Instead, she said the thing that stayed with me all the way home. She said, You owe this family more than you think, Willa. Not more than you know. More than you think. Like there was a number I hadn't been shown yet. Like there was a bill already written in my name that I hadn't seen. I drove back to Larkin Road, turning that sentence over and over. I didn't sleep that night. Some part of me had already started counting. Bryn called me a few days later, and my sister has never once called just to talk. She led with sugar, the way she always does. She told me she was thrilled about the wedding. She told me Elliot seemed nice. Then she got to it. Sideways, the way she gets to everything. She said the farm was really the family's place, wasn't it? Since Grandma had lived there. And wouldn't it be lovely if it stayed in the family properly? I told her it was in the family. It was mine, and I was family. She laughed her light little laugh, the one that means she's decided you're being difficult. You know what I mean, she said. Then she said something that stuck a hook in me. She said, "Don't worry about it, Willie. It's all going to get sorted out soon." Sorted out? I asked her what that meant. She'd already moved on, chattering about her daughter, my niece Piper, who was 6, and the one genuinely good thing to come out of my sister. Piper had drawn me a picture of the farm, all crooked windows and a giant yellow sun. Bryn put her on the phone, and Piper told me the sun was so big. "So you can find your way home, Aunt Willa." I nearly cried right there at the kitchen sink. Then Bryn took the phone back, and the sugar was gone, and she said, "Brisk now. Anyway, talk soon." My sister always smiled widest right before she took something. I'd watched her do it our whole lives. At Christmas, at Grandma's funeral, at the reading of the will where she'd cried prettily and asked the lawyer twice about the property. Sorted out soon. I hung up and stood in my kitchen and listened to my own house tick around me, and for the first time it didn't feel entirely like mine. That feeling sent me down a hallway of memory I usually keep the door shut on. I was 9 years old. It was the night before Bryn's dance recital, and the house was all activity for her and none for me, which was ordinary, so ordinary I'd stopped noticing. I'd come downstairs for water and stopped in the dark of the hall because my mother was on the phone with my aunt, and my mother's voice had that low, honest tone she only used when she thought no one could hear. She was talking about me. She said I was a strange child, too serious, too much like Grandma Ruth. And then she said the thing. She said, "Sometimes I look at her and I swear she was never really one of us." I stood in that dark hallway and felt the sentence land somewhere deep and stay there. Never really one of us. I was 9. I didn't have words for what it did to me. I just went back upstairs without my water and lay in the dark and understood, in the wordless way children understand things, that I had been weighed and found separate. I never told anyone. I built my whole life around being useful enough that maybe someday I'd be counted in. I became the nurse, the reliable one, the one who never caught fire, and some starved little part of me kept waiting for my mother to look at me one day and take it back. She never did. Standing in my kitchen at 33 with my sister's voice still in my ear, I finally let myself know that she never would. I didn't cry over it that night. I'd done my crying at 9. What I felt instead was clarity, cold and clean, like the moment in a code when everything else falls away and you just do the next right thing. I started quietly to pay attention. Paying attention, for me, meant going back to doing what I do best, which is watching and documenting. The wedding gave me plenty to watch. Elliot and I were paying for most of it ourselves. We'd booked the Hartley barn out past the edge of town, a working event barn with string lights and a big pull-down screen the owners used for couples slideshows. It was modest and it was ours. My parents made sure to have opinions. My mother called to say it was a shame to waste money on a party when Bryn was drowning. My father, who barely spoke to me directly anymore, sent word through my mother that the whole thing was a lot of fuss. Bryn offered to help plan and then used every planning conversation to circle back to the farm. Wouldn't it be smart, she'd say, to have the family's assets organized before I married a stranger? Elliot was not a stranger. Elliot was the first person in my adult life who looked at what I carried and offered to carry half. He never once mentioned the house except to say it was mine and he was glad I had it. That's how I knew. In my family, love came with an invoice. Elliot's didn't. One evening, he found me at the kitchen table with Grandma's old ledger open, tracing her handwriting with one finger, and he didn't ask what was wrong. He just made tea and sat with me until I was ready. "Your family's circling something," he said finally. "I don't know what. But you should trust the part of you that already knows." I did know. I just didn't have the shape of it yet. 2 days later, the shape arrived. It came in the mailbox at the end of my long gravel drive, in a stiff envelope with a certified mail stamp and a return address I didn't recognize. I stood at the mailbox in the cold and turned it over and didn't open it. Some part of me knew that once I did, there'd be no unknowing it. I opened it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. The letterhead belonged to a title insurance company. The language was the careful, bloodless language that companies use when something has gone wrong and they don't want to be the ones to say it plainly. As part of a routine records review, they wrote, they had identified a recently recorded document affecting the property at my address on Larkin Road. They were writing to confirm whether the transaction was authorized by all parties of record. There was a reference number. There was a phone number. There was no explanation of what the document actually was. I read it 3 times, the way I read a chart that doesn't add up. A recently recorded document affecting my property. I had not signed anything. I had not authorized anything. I had not sold, refinanced, gifted, or altered 1 square inch of that farm. My grandmother's voice came to me across the years, tapping her ledger. Paper doesn't forget. Someone had put paper into the world with my house's name on it, and I hadn't held the pen. My first instinct was not panic. Panic is a luxury you learn to skip in an emergency room. My first instinct was to find out exactly what I was looking at before I decided how scared to be. I set the letter down flat, smoothed it with my hand, and did the thing my grandmother taught me. I got a fresh page and I wrote down the date, the reference number, the company's name, and 1 sentence. I did not authorize any document on this property. Then I picked up the phone. It was after 5. Their office was closed. I sat in my quiet kitchen with a letter that said someone had reached into the one thing that was truly mine, and I had a whole night to wait before I could find out who. That was the longest night I'd had since Grandma died. I was on the phone the second the title company opened. The woman who took my call was kind and careful and could tell me almost nothing that helped. There was a document in the chain of title, recently recorded at the county. She couldn't interpret it for me. She could only confirm it existed and that it had triggered their review. She told me the fastest way to see it with my own eyes was to go to the source, the county recorder's office in the county seat, 40 minutes east of Larkin Road. Public records. Anyone could request a certified copy. That word, public, did something to me. Whatever had been done to my house had been done out in the open, filed in a government building where it would sit as fact until someone challenged it. I called the recorder's office next. A patient clerk explained that yes, I could request certified copies of any recorded instrument on my parcel. But certified copies took a few business days to prepare and had to be either picked up or mailed. A few business days. In an ER, a few business days is the difference between a problem you catch and a problem that catches you. I asked if I could see anything sooner. She said I could come in and view the record on their public terminal, but the office closed at 4 and I had 3 night shifts back to back that week. I did the math and hated it. The soonest I could physically stand in that office was 5 days out. I asked her to start preparing certified copies anyway. I gave her my name, my parcel number off the tax bill, and my grandmother's name for the older records. Then I hung up and stood in my kitchen with the machinery of the thing grinding slowly forward, 5 days from an answer, and I understood that whoever had done this had counted on exactly that. On the slowness, on me being reliable and busy and easy to outrun. That Sunday, my mother summoned me to dinner in town, and I went, because I wanted to watch their faces more than I wanted to stay home safe. The house I grew up in still smelled the same, pot roast and lemon polish, a smell that used to mean family and now just meant careful. My father sat at the head of the table and barely said a word to me the whole night. My mother orbited the kitchen, bright and busy, working the room like a woman selling something. Bryn was there with Piper, who climbed into my lap between courses and told me about a caterpillar she'd named Gerald, after my father, which made even him almost smile. Then the plates were cleared and the real reason for the invitation walked out from behind the small talk. My mother sat down across from me and said the family had been thinking about the future, about making sure things were secure, and wasn't it time we all sat down with a lawyer and got the farm handled properly. I kept my voice level and my hands still. I said the farm was handled. Grandma's will had handled it 2 years ago. My mother's smile tightened. Bryn, who'd been quiet, leaned in and said too casually, "So you haven't signed anything yet?" The table went still for exactly one breath. My mother shot her a look. Bryn caught herself and laughed and said she just meant, "You know, with the wedding and everything, there's so much paperwork." But I'd heard it. Signed anything yet? As if signing were expected. As if a document were already out there in the world, waiting for my name to make it complete. I filed that away with the will-reading smile and the certified letter and the 5-day wait, and I felt the pieces begin, slowly, to line up into a shape. I smiled back at my sister and said I hadn't signed a thing, which was true, and which, I could see it land, was not what she'd hoped to hear. 5 days later, on a gray Tuesday morning after a brutal night shift, I drove the 40 minutes east to the county recorder's office instead of going home to sleep. The clerk remembered my call. She slid a manila folder across the counter and I opened it right there under the fluorescent lights, still in my scrubs, running on coffee and dread. On top was the certified copy of my grandmother's deed, the one from the will, clean and correct. The farmhouse on Larkin Road recorded to me alone. Seeing it in official black and white steadied me for exactly as long as it took to turn the page. Underneath it was a second document, a quitclaim deed, recently recorded, and on it, transferring an interest in my property, was a signature. My signature, Willa Monroe, in a looping hand that leaned the way mine leans, close enough to fool a stranger, wrong enough to stop my breath. I had never seen this document before in my life. I had never signed it. Below my forged name, added as a new owner of the farm my grandmother left to me alone, was a name I knew as well as my own. Bryn Monroe. My sister had put her name on my house and forged mine to do it. I stood at that counter for a long moment, and I did not make a sound. The clerk asked if I was all right. I said I needed certified copies of both documents, and I needed to know the exact date this second one was recorded, and I needed the name of the notary who'd stamped it. She looked at me a little differently then, the way people do when they realize they're standing at the edge of somebody else's disaster. She started making my copies. I looked down at the forgery of my own name and felt something in me go very quiet and very clear. Not rage. Rage is loud and stupid. This was the other thing. This was the feeling right before you start doing the work. I did not drive to my mother's house and scream. That's what they would have expected, and a person who reacts is a person you can manage. Instead, I drove home to Larkin Road, slept 4 hours because a shaking nurse helps no one, and then I called a lawyer. Karen Vosberg had handled real estate in that county for 20 years and had a reputation for being unshakable. I laid the 2 deeds out on my kitchen table and read her everything over the phone, slow and exact, the way I'd give a report on a crashing patient. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the words that changed the shape of my fear into the shape of a plan. She said, "Willa, a forged signature on a deed isn't a family argument. It's forgery. It's a crime." She explained it in the plain terms I needed. The quitclaim deed was almost certainly void because you can't transfer away someone's property with a signature they never wrote. But void wasn't automatic. A forged document, once recorded, sits on the public record looking exactly like a real one until a court is asked to strike it. To clear my title cleanly, we'd need to file, we'd need to prove the forgery, and we'd need the county's records to back the story. She told me to gather everything and touch nothing electronic of theirs, to keep my hands completely clean. She said, "Do not confront them. People who forge documents get desperate when they're cornered, and desperate people do bigger, dumber things." She had no idea how right she was. While she was still talking, my phone started buzzing against the table with my mother's name on the screen. Once, twice, 3 times in a row. I looked at it, and I let it ring. For the first time in my life, I let my mother's call go, and I felt the ground shift under me, because I finally understood I was the one holding the pen now. Karen told me to gather everything, and there was one thing I hadn't touched since the funeral. Grandma Ruth's green metal box. It lived under the stairs on Larkin Road exactly where it had always lived, and after she died, I'd carried it to the farm and slid it into the same kind of dark cubby, and then I'd left it alone, because opening it meant admitting she was really gone. That night, after Karen's call, I finally pulled it out. It was heavier than I remembered. The paint was chipped at the corners, worn down to gray metal where her hands had gripped it 1,000 times. I set it on the kitchen table under the low light, and I sat with it for a while before I opened it. The way you sit with a patient's family before you say the hard thing. My grandmother had told me once, near the end, when the morphine made her honest, "Everything you'll ever need is in that box, Willa. Everything they'll try to take. That's where the truth of it lives." I'd thought she was wandering. I thought she meant keepsakes. I ran my thumb along the seam of the lid, and I thought about the forged deed sitting in a government building with my sister's name on my house, and I thought about a mother who wore calculation like perfume, and I thought about a 9-year-old in a dark hallway hearing she was never really one of them. I lifted the lid. Inside, the smell of cedar and old paper rose up like she'd just closed it yesterday. On top, folded once, was a piece of stationery in her round, deliberate hand. And under that, in a manila sleeve she'd labeled in block letters, was a copy of the deed to the farm. The original recording? The real one. The one that said this house was mine before anyone ever tried to forge me out of it. I reached for her letter first. I unfolded my grandmother's letter under the kitchen light, and I heard her voice in every line. She'd written it the last spring she was alive, though she never gave it to me. She wrote the way she talked, plain and unafraid. She wrote that she knew exactly what my parents were. She wrote that she'd watched them dote on Bryn and lean on me my whole life, and that it had broken something in her she never let me see. "I didn't leave you this farm because you needed a house," she wrote. "I left it to you because you needed proof. Proof that somebody chose you first, on purpose. In writing, where no one could argue it away later." I had to stop reading and put my hand flat on the table. Then came the line. She'd written it near the bottom, underlined once, in that round teacher's hand that had signed my report cards when my parents forgot to come to conferences. "This house already knows who it belongs to. Don't let anyone move you from it." I read it and I read it again, and something that had been loose in me my whole life clicked into place and held. This house already knows who it belongs to. She'd known. Somehow, 2 years before a title company ever mailed me a warning, my grandmother had known that someone would come for this farm, and she'd left me not just the deed, but the words to stand on while I fought for it. Under the letter, in the manila sleeve, the real recording sat clean and certified and unbreakable. I laid it beside the forged copy I'd gotten from the county. The truth and the lie, side by side on my kitchen table. I photographed nothing of theirs, touched nothing I shouldn't. I just built a folder, the good old-fashioned kind, paper in a paper sleeve, the way Ruth Monroe would have done it. The real deed, Grandma's letter, the title company's warning, my own dated notes, and I put her stationery on top, folded once, so that every time I opened that folder, the first thing I'd see was her handwriting telling me the house already knew. I slept that night, first time in weeks. The next morning, I showed Elliot everything. I spread it across the table like I was presenting a case, because in a way, I was. He read Karen's notes, the forged deed, my grandmother's letter. When he got to the line about the house knowing who it belonged to, he was quiet for a while. Then he did the thing I love him for. He didn't get angry on my behalf, which would have made it about his anger. He got practical. He said, "Okay, so we know what they did. The question is, what they do next." We talked it through the way we talk through everything. Slow, no drama. Karen was already moving on the legal side, preparing to file to void the forged deed and refer the forgery to the county. That would grind forward on its own schedule. But Elliot pointed at the pattern, the thing my family had done my entire life. "They don't do quiet," he said. "They do audiences. Every time they've wanted something from you, they've done it in front of people. So the pressure's on you to keep the peace." He was right. The soft ask over the good coffee. The family has been talking dinner. Bryn's little public jabs. They didn't want to steal the farm in the dark. They wanted me to hand it over in the light, smiling, so it would look like a gift, and no one could call it a theft. And the biggest audience I had coming was my wedding. Elliot said it carefully, watching my face. "If they're going to make a scene, they'll make it where it costs you the most to say no." The Hartley barn. 150 guests. A pull-down screen already wired for a slideshow. I looked at the folder on the table, the truth sitting there in paper and my grandmother's hand, and I made a decision that felt less like revenge and more like triage. I said, "Then if they bring the scene to me, I'll be ready to show everyone what's actually in it." I would not strike first. I would just stop being the one who kept the peace by disappearing. Karen and I spent the next 2 weeks building the paper, and every piece we pulled made the picture uglier and clearer. The forged quitclaim had been recorded 3 weeks before that certified letter ever reached my mailbox. Whoever filed it had moved fast and moved first, betting I wouldn't look until it was too late. The recorder's office keeps a log of who submits documents and which notary acknowledged them, and Karen knew how to read it. The notary was a woman named Alderman, who ran a little shopfront service near the courthouse, the kind of place that stamps 100 routine papers a week. Karen called on a pretext and, without saying anything she shouldn't, learned enough. A woman had come in with a deed already drawn up. She'd presented identification and said she was signing on behalf of her sister, who couldn't make it. The notary, following the letter of a busy day, had acknowledged the signature that was placed in front of her. The description of the woman was thin, but it fit. Brown hair to the shoulders. Confident. A little impatient. A young daughter waiting in a chair by the door. Coloring. Piper. My stomach turned at that. At the thought of my niece sitting in a notary's office while her mother forged my name 3 feet away, and Piper not knowing a thing, just coloring a sun so big I could find my way home. Karen was gentle but firm. The notary's account, the log, the recording date, the 2 deeds side by side, my grandmother's original in the box, all of it braided into one clean rope. This was no longer a suspicion. This was a case. Bryn had physically walked my house into a government office and signed my name to give herself half of it. The only question left was whether my mother had merely blessed it or helped build it. I already suspected the answer. 2 days later, without meaning to look for it, I found the proof, and it came from the last hands I'd have expected. It came from Piper. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. Bryn dropped Piper at the farm for a few hours because a sitter fell through and, as always, I was the reliable one, the one you could always leave a child with. I didn't mind. Piper is the one person in that family I'd walk through fire for. She had Bryn's old tablet with her, a cracked hand-me-down loaded with cartoons, and she asked if I could get her show going. I took the tablet to tap the app, and it woke to a messaging thread Bryn had left open, because my sister has never once thought about who might see her mess. I did not scroll. I want you to know that. I have handled other people's private information my whole career, and I know exactly where the line is. But the message on the screen, the one already open, put itself in front of my eyes before I could look away. It was to my mother. It said, "The wedding's our last shot. Once she signs in front of everyone, she can't back out. Mom, you have to sell it before the bank comes." I read it once. Then I got Piper's cartoon going, set the tablet gently in her hands, and stepped into the next room with my own heart going like a drum. I did not touch that thread again. I did not go digging. I called Karen and told her exactly what had appeared, unbidden, on a child's borrowed tablet, and I asked her what I was and wasn't allowed to do. She told me to leave it entirely alone, that our case lived and died on the county records, not on messages I had no right to. "We don't need it," she said. "The forgery proves itself." She was right, but 2 words from that message had lodged in me and wouldn't leave. "Before the bank comes." There was a bank in this. There was a clock I hadn't seen yet. And it was ticking against somebody. Just maybe not me. That night I sat with Karen on the phone and we laid it all out end to end. And somewhere in the laying out, the fear left me and something steadier moved in. Here is what we knew, and here is what mattered most. Bryn had forged my name and recorded a false deed. My mother knew, and from the tone of that message she wasn't just blessing it. She was the one being begged to act. There was a bank involved and a deadline none of us could see the shape of yet. And, most important of all, my family had no idea that I knew any of it. They thought I was still their reliable Willa, busy and trusting, 5 days behind everything. They thought they were hunting me. They had no idea I already had the whole map. Karen advised patience, and it was the hardest advice I've ever taken. She said the cleanest path was to let the legal filing mature, keep every fact documented, and not tip my hand. If I confronted them now, they'd scatter, lawyer up, maybe file something worse, and turn a clean forgery case into a muddy family war. But if I stayed quiet, if I let them believe their plan was still on rails, they would walk straight into whatever room they'd chosen and expose themselves in front of the exact witnesses I'd need. "Let them think it's working," Karen said, "right up until it doesn't." So that's what I did. From that night on, I smiled at my mother's calls. I answered Bryn's little jabs with a mild nothing. I let them keep believing I was soft and busy and easy to run down. It was the strangest kind of power I'd ever held and the quietest. I knew how the story ended. They didn't. Every day they strutted a step closer to a cliff they couldn't see, and all I had to do was keep my grandmother's folder ready and my mouth shut. The only question left was where they'd choose to jump. I was fairly sure I already knew the answer. It had string lights and a pull-down screen. The pieces snapped onto a calendar over the next few days, and once I saw the dates lined up, I understood I wasn't the only one racing a clock. 3 deadlines were closing on the same point. The first was my wedding, 16 days out, fixed and public and impossible for my family to resist as a stage. The second was Karen's filing to void the forged deed, which she wanted in front of the county before month's end, because the longer a false document sits unchallenged, the more it can tangle a title. And the third was the one I couldn't see clearly yet. The bank in Bryn's message, the "before the bank comes," that had its own countdown running somewhere in town. Everything my family did now had a rushed, brittle quality, like people trying to close a door before the wind takes it. My mother's calls got more frequent and more syrupy. She wanted to make peace before the big day. She wanted us to be a united family for the wedding. Then, 4 days out, she left a voicemail that I saved and still have. Her voice was calm in a way that was worse than shouting. She said, "We'll all be there on your day, honey, the whole family. Wear something nice. We're going to settle this once and for all. Settle this. On my wedding day. In front of everyone." I stood in my kitchen and listened to it twice, and instead of fear, I felt an almost surgical calm settle over me. They'd chosen the room. They'd chosen the audience. They'd RSVP'd to their own undoing and called it a family reunion. I called Elliot and played him the message. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, let's make sure the screen's ready." We had 4 days. I spent them the way my grandmother would have. I got the folder in order, I got the file loaded, and I checked everything 3 times. I want to be honest about the night before I stopped hesitating, because I almost didn't do any of it. 3 nights before the wedding, I sat at my kitchen table with my grandmother's letter in my lap, and I nearly talked myself out of the whole thing. Not the wedding. The truth. I thought, maybe I should call my mother privately. Maybe I should show her the folder alone, in her kitchen, and give her the chance to call the whole thing off before it ever reached the barn. Keep it a family matter. Spare Piper a scene. Spare all of us. I sat there a long time with that soft, familiar pull, the one that had run my whole life, the one that said if you just absorb it quietly, you can keep the peace. If you've ever talked yourself out of protecting your own peace to spare someone who never once spared you, comment, I see you, because I need you to know you're not alone in that chair. Then stay with me, because here's what I finally understood at that table. Elliot came in and found me there, and I told him what I was thinking. He sat down and took my hand, and he didn't argue. He just said one thing. The private road, the quiet one where you fix it yourselves and nobody gets embarrassed, you've been offering them that road your whole life. They burned it. Every time. They chose the audience. Let them stand in it. He was right. And I knew he was right, because I'd offered that road at the coffee table and the dinner table and on a dozen phone calls, and every single time they'd chosen instead to press harder in front of more people. They didn't want a private resolution, they wanted a public surrender. So I folded my grandmother's letter and put it back on top of the folder, and I made my decision. If they wanted to do this in front of 150 people, then 150 people would see all of it. Not just their version, all of it. 2 days before the wedding, Karen called with the piece that finally explained everything, and it came, fittingly, from the public record, the same open books my family had thought no one would ever read. She'd been pulling the recorded documents around my parents' house in town, the one I grew up in, and the story was all there in liens and filings for anyone patient enough to look. Years ago, my parents had opened a home equity line of credit against their own house, a big one. And over the past 3 years, in withdrawal after withdrawal, they had drained it nearly dry. $180,000, pulled out in chunks that lined up almost to the week, with each of Bryn's failed boutiques and bailouts and hard stretches. They had mortgaged the roof over their own heads to keep my sister afloat, and now the line was maxed, the payments were behind, and there were notices in the record with a lender's name, and the ugly word default. That was the bank in Bryn's message. That was the clock. My parents were about to lose their own house, the house I grew up in, because they had spent it all on the daughter they favored, and the only unencumbered, paid-off, clean-titled asset left standing in the entire family was a certain farmhouse on Larkin Road that an old woman had deliberately left to the daughter they didn't. They didn't want my house because they were cruel, or not only because of that. They wanted it because it was the last dry ground in a flood they'd made themselves. I sat with that for a long time. I even felt something close to pity, for about a minute. Then I remembered a forged signature and a 9-year-old in a dark hallway, and a mother rehearsing a funeral for a living daughter, and the pity folded itself small and quiet and got out of the way. Desperation explains people. It doesn't excuse them. And it certainly doesn't entitle them to the one thing my grandmother left me to prove I was chosen. Once I understood the money, the rest of their plan unfolded in my mind like a diagram, and the sheer sick cleverness of it took my breath. They knew the forged deed was shaky. A forged signature can be challenged, and if I ever looked closely, the whole thing would collapse and Bryn could face real trouble. What they needed was for me to sign a real one, a genuine transfer, in my own true hand, freely given, that no court could ever unwind. And the fastest way to get a reluctant, reliable, peacekeeping woman to sign away her home is to corner her in public, wrap the ask in grief and shame, and make refusing feel like a cruelty performed in front of everyone she knows. That was the black clothing. That was the funeral costume. My mother wasn't mourning a death. She was staging one, casting me as the daughter who'd killed the family by refusing to help, so that a barn full of my friends and neighbors would turn to me in my white dress and silently beg me to just sign it and make the sad woman stop. It was emotional theater engineered to override my judgment with humiliation, and 2 years ago, maybe even 2 months ago, it might have worked. I'd spent my whole life folding under exactly that kind of pressure, disappearing to keep the peace, signing whatever kept the noise down. They were counting on the Willa they'd manufactured. They had no way of knowing that Willa had spent the last month reading her grandmother's ledger and her grandmother's letter and learning, finally, that being chosen once, on purpose, in writing, was worth more than a lifetime of their approval. I knew exactly what they were going to do now. I knew the costume, the mic, the tears, the timing. And because I knew, I could do the one thing they'd never planned for. I could let them finish the whole performance and then turn on the lights. The day before the wedding, Elliot and I went out to the Hartley barn to help set up, and while the florist fussed with mason jars and the caterer counted chairs, we did one more quiet piece of work. The barn's owner showed us how the slideshow ran: a simple laptop wired to the projector and the big pull-down screen, a remote to advance the slides. Our wedding slideshow was already loaded, the ordinary sweet one, Elliot and me at the lake, the porch, Piper's crayon drawing of the farm scanned in with the giant yellow sun. And then, in a second folder, Elliot named something plain and forgettable. We loaded the other file, not out of cruelty, as insurance. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me and it might matter to you. I did not build that file hoping to use it. I built it the way I keep a crash cart stocked, praying I never need it and ready if I do. Slide 1, my grandmother's real recorded deed, the farm to me alone. Slide 2, the forged quitclaim, my faked signature beside Bryn's real name, next to the notary's log and the fraud reference number. Slide 3, the public record of the home equity line, the withdrawals, the default notices, and the plain arithmetic of where the money went. I reviewed every slide 3 times, the nurse in me refusing to let a single detail be wrong, because I knew that if this ever went up on that screen, it had to be unarguable. We set one rule between us and we said it out loud so neither of us could pretend later. The truth file stayed dark unless they forced it into the light. If my family came and behaved like people, it would never run. If they stood up in front of my guests and tried to take my home by shame, Elliot would advance one slide, and the room would see what I'd been carrying alone. We locked the barn, drove back to Larkin Road, and tried to sleep. My father called me late that night, and it was the strangest call of my life. He almost never phoned me directly. My mother had been the switchboard of our family for 30 years. But there he was, my father, his voice low and rough, calling the night before my wedding. For a moment I let myself hope. He said my name, just Willa, and then he was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said, "You don't have to come tomorrow if you don't want to." It took me a second to understand he meant I didn't have to attend my own wedding, that he was, in his clumsy way, trying to warn me off, to tell me to stay away from what my mother had planned. It was the closest thing to protection my father had ever offered me, and for one aching moment he knew all of it. The forgery, the funeral costume, the plan to shame me in front of everyone, and his idea of protecting me was to tell me to stay home so I wouldn't be there to say no. He wasn't a bystander being dragged along. He was a man who'd chosen, again, the easy loyalty over the hard right thing, and dressed his cowardice up as fatherly advice. "I'll be there, Dad," I said. I wouldn't miss it. And I hung up before he could hear that I meant it as a promise, not a comfort. The morning of the wedding, getting ready in a little side room at the barn, I thought about who exactly was going to be sitting in those chairs, and I realized my family had made one enormous miscalculation. They'd chosen my wedding as their stage because they thought the audience would pressure me. They never stopped to think about who the audience actually was. These weren't strangers who'd side with a crying mother. My guest list was a decade of my real life. Half the night shift from the ER was out there, nurses and one ER doctor who'd watched me stay calm through things that would break most people. My neighbors from Larkin Road were there, the ones who knew that farm was mine because they'd watched me paint the porch and plow the drive. My maid of honor was there, and her husband, who happened to be a sheriff's deputy in that very county, a man who knew exactly what a forged deed meant. And, in a twist, my mother would come to regret with her whole soul. My parents' own pastor was there, invited by them, a soft-spoken man who'd baptized Bryn and buried my grandmother and believed, sincerely, that this was a day of joy. My mother had built her scene for a jury of sympathetic strangers. Instead, she was about to perform it for a room full of people who knew me, respected me, and in at least one case carried a badge. I stood in that little room in my grandmother's borrowed pearls, and I looked at myself in the mirror, and I felt her folder tucked safe in Elliot's jacket like a second heartbeat. Then the coordinator knocked and put her head in, apologetic, and said there'd been 2 late additions to the seating: family, a Carol and Gerald Monroe. My parents had RSVP'd no, now they were here. I swallowed hard and I nodded and I said, "Seat them wherever they like. They'll move anyway." She didn't understand that. In a couple of hours, everyone would. There's a stillness that comes over me before something big, and I felt it settle in that side room as the minutes ticked down. It's the same stillness I feel when a patient is crashing and the whole world narrows to the next right move. I took my grandmother's letter out of my bag one last time and read the line I already knew by heart. "This house already knows who it belongs to. Don't let anyone move you from it." I folded it and pressed it flat and made myself a set of promises, the way I'd map out a plan before a hard shift. I would not grab the microphone back and shout. I would not sing to my mother's theater or match her volume. Whatever she said, however she performed, I would stay quiet. Because I'd finally learned that quiet isn't the same as weak, and calm in a storm is its own kind of authority. I would let her finish. I would let the whole barn see exactly what she'd come to do. In her own words. In her funeral black. And then, only then, when the room had seen her clearly, I would nod to my husband, and the truth I'd carried alone would stop being mine to carry. I laid 2 things out on the little vanity in front of the mirror, side by side, the way you lay out what matters before you'll need it fast. My grandmother's folded letter, and, in Elliot's steady hand where he waited by the door, the small remote that advanced the slides. 2 objects, one to stand on, one to turn the lights on with. The coordinator knocked. The music started up out in the barn, soft and warm through the wall. I could hear the shuffle of 150 people finding their seats. Somewhere out there, my mother was putting on a black veil at my wedding. I smoothed my white dress, and I picked up my bouquet, and I walked out to meet all of it. The ceremony itself was beautiful, and I'm not going to let them have that part, so I'll keep it. Elliot waited for me under an arch of wildflowers with his calm hands folded and his eyes going bright the second he saw me. The pastor spoke gently about steadiness, about 2 people choosing each other on purpose, and I thought of my grandmother's word, chosen, and had to breathe carefully to keep from crying in a good way. We said our vows. We meant them. For 11 minutes I forgot there was a folder, forgot there was a forgery, forgot my parents sitting stiff and dark in the 3rd row like 2 crows at a garden party. Then it was done, and we were married and the room stood and cheered, and we walked back up the aisle into the reception space where the string lights glowed and the big screen hung ready at the front. That's when I felt the temperature of the room change. I'd worked enough trauma bays to feel a shift in a crowd before I can name it, and I felt it then. A ripple near the 3rd row. Chairs scraping, a low murmur moving outward like the first ring from a stone dropped in water. I turned, and there they were, on their feet now, the 3 of them moving toward the front of the barn while the guests they passed went quiet and confused. My mother in unrelieved black, the veil down over her face, my father behind her in that stiff black suit, and my sister between them, chin up, that folder under her arm, a pen already in her hand like a woman arriving to close a deal. Elliot's fingers found mine and squeezed once. Across the barn I saw the coordinator freeze, saw the pastor's confused smile, saw the deputy at table 4 set down his fork. My mother reached the front and she walked straight to the DJ's little table and she picked up the microphone. And the cold open of this story finally caught up to the room. For a moment nobody stopped her, because nobody could believe it was happening. A woman in full mourning black had just crossed a wedding reception and taken the microphone, and 150 people sat suspended between confusion and alarm, waiting for someone to tell them how to feel. My mother lifted her veil just enough to be seen. She had put on her grieving face, the one I'd watched her use at every funeral of my childhood, the trembling chin, the glistening eyes, the whole practiced apparatus of a woman performing a sorrow she'd decided to feel. She looked out over my guests, and she let the silence stretch, because she'd always understood that silence is where an audience leans in. My father took up a position just behind her shoulder, hands folded, eyes down, the very picture of a man in grief. And Bryn stood a little to the side with her folder and her pen, and she did the thing that told the whole room who she really was. She smiled. Not a nervous smile, a pleased one, the smile of someone who thinks she's about to win, who's been promised the thing she wants and can already feel it in her hands. I stood at the front of my own wedding in my white dress with my new husband beside me, and I watched my family arrange themselves into the tableau they'd rehearsed, the mourners and the deal closer, and I felt no panic at all. I felt the strange, level clarity of a person who has read the last page of a book everyone else thinks is still being written. The pastor half rose from his chair, uncertain. A neighbor near the front said, "Carol? What in the world?" My mother ignored them all. She raised the microphone to her lips, and she looked at me across the barn, across 33 years, across a 9-year-old in a dark hallway and an old woman's green metal box, and she opened her mouth to begin the performance that was going to end her. "I'm sorry to interrupt," my mother said into the microphone, in a voice pitched to carry to the back of the barn. "But a mother has to speak." She pressed a black-gloved hand to her chest. She told my guests that this was the hardest day of her life. She told them that she had raised 2 daughters to love each other, and that one of them had turned her back on the family when the family needed her most. She never said my name. She didn't have to. She let her tears do the pointing. She said her other daughter, her Bryn, was suffering, and that all she was asking, all any grieving mother could ask, was for her fortunate daughter to share what she had. And then she said it. The line she'd worn black to deliver, the line that had been sitting under this whole story like a stone under still water. She looked at me in my wedding dress and said, "We can only mourn one daughter today." The barn went utterly silent. Somewhere a chair creaked. My mother let the horror of it settle, and then she drove it home. "We'll stay right here," she said, "until you sign this house over to your sister." On cue, Bryn stepped forward with the folder open and the pen held out toward me across 10 feet of wooden floor, and my sister laughed. A bright, disbelieving, delighted little laugh, because she genuinely thought I was going to walk over there in front of everyone and sign. I did not move toward the pen. I looked at my mother, and I looked at my father with his eyes on the floor, and I looked at my sister's outstretched hand, and I felt Elliot shift his weight beside me. He set down the glass he'd been holding. He stood up to his full height, unhurried, the calmest man in a barn full of frightened people. And every head in the room turned from my mother's black veil to my husband rising slowly to his feet. Elliot didn't raise his voice. He didn't point a finger at my mother or say a single cruel thing. He simply looked at the room, then at me, and asked quietly, "Willa, is it all right if I show them?" And I, in my white dress, with my mother's tears still hanging in the air and my sister's pen still held out toward me, gave the only answer I'd been rehearsing for a month. I didn't shout it. I said it softly, almost kindly, the way you speak to a patient right before you tell them the truth they've been dreading. "Yes," I said. "I think everyone should see the rest of it." Then I turned to my mother and I spoke to her directly for the first time, and my voice was steady and low, and it carried anyway, because a quiet room amplifies a calm voice better than any microphone. "You can put that down now, Mom," I said. "You came here to bury me in front of my friends. The least I can do is let them come to the whole funeral." My mother's grieving face flickered. Just for an instant the performance slipped, and underneath it I saw the thing she'd never once shown me, which was fear. She hadn't planned for this. In all her rehearsals of my humiliation, she had never once cast me as calm. She'd built the entire scene around the daughter she'd manufactured, the reliable one who folds, who signs, who disappears to keep the peace. And that daughter wasn't in the room. She recovered fast. I'll give her that. She lifted the microphone again and her voice sharpened. "Willa, don't you dare make a scene at your own wedding," she said, which was a sentence so upside down that a few of my guests actually gasped. But I wasn't listening to her anymore. I was watching Elliot walk to the little laptop at the side of the screen, and I was watching Bryn's pleased smile begin, for the first time, to waver. Because my sister had just noticed that I wasn't afraid, and Bryn had always known that I was only ever dangerous when I stopped being afraid. Elliot touched the laptop, and the big pull-down screen at the front of the Hartley barn woke up bright and white in the dim reception light, and 150 faces turned toward it. The first slide filled the screen. It was a clean, official document, enlarged so that even the guests in the back could read the heavy county stamp across the bottom. My grandmother's deed, the real one, the recording that said, in the plain, unarguable language of the public record, that the farmhouse and land on Larkin Road belonged to Willa Monroe, transferred by the last will of Ruth Monroe, deceased 2 years prior. I watched the room read it. I watched them understand. My mother had just told this barn that I was refusing to share a family house, and here on the screen was the state of the county certifying, in stamped black and white, that there was nothing to share, that the house had been left to me alone, on purpose, by the woman who'd raised me. A murmur went through the guests, low and turning. My mother's head snapped toward the screen and her mouth opened. "That doesn't mean anything," she said into the mic, but her voice had lost its churchly command and picked up a thin, brittle edge. "Family is family. That house should be—" "It's Grandma's deed, Carol," said a voice from the neighbor's table, my old neighbor from Larkin Road. Not unkindly, just stunned. "That's Ruth's writing on the will right there." Bryn had gone very still. The pen in her outstretched hand had drifted down toward her side, forgotten. She was staring at the screen with the particular frozen look of a person who is doing frantic math about what comes next, because Bryn knew, better than anyone in that room, that if slide 1 was the real deed, then there was almost certainly a slide 2. And slide 2 was the one with her name on it. Elliot's thumb rested on the remote. He glanced at me. I gave the smallest nod. He advanced the slide. The second slide came up, and the barn made a sound I'd never heard a crowd make before, a collective intake of breath, sharp and unanimous. It was the forged quitclaim deed, enlarged huge on the screen so no one could miss it, my own name in a looping counterfeit hand, Willa Monroe, signed to a document I had never touched. And beside my forged signature, added as a new owner of my grandmother's farm, the real, undisputed name, Bryn Monroe. Elliot had laid it out beside the notary's log and the county's reference number, and under it, in plain type I'd added myself. One line. "This signature is a forgery. I never signed this document." For a moment nobody spoke. Then heads began to turn, slowly, away from the screen and toward my sister, who stood frozen in the middle of my wedding with a pen in her hand and every eye in the room landing on her at once. "Bryn," my mother said, and it came out as a hiss, off mic now, but the barn was so silent it carried anyway. Bryn's face had gone the gray-white of someone about to be sick. "That's not— I didn't— that's a mistake," she started, and it was the worst possible thing to say, because it wasn't a denial, it was a fumble, and every person in that room heard it as one. At table 4, the sheriff's deputy stood up. He didn't rush, he didn't shout. He just rose to his full height in his good suit and looked at the screen, and then at Bryn, with the flat, patient attention of a man who has recognized a crime, and that quiet motion did more to empty the air out of my sister than any accusation could have. Bryn took a step backward. The pen finally fell from her hand and clattered on the wooden floor, loud in the silence. and my mother, watching her favorite daughter's forgery blown up 10 feet tall in front of a pastor and a deputy, and everyone they knew, made the fatal mistake of reaching for the microphone one more time. "This is a private family matter," my mother said into the microphone, her voice climbing now, losing the grief, finding the panic. "Turn that off. Turn it off right now." I looked at Elliot. I looked at the room. And I made the last decision of that long month. "Show them the rest," I said, and I still didn't raise my voice. Elliot advanced the slide. The third slide was the money. My parents' home equity line laid bare in the public record, the $180,000 drawn down withdrawal by withdrawal, the default notices, the lender's letters, the plain and terrible arithmetic of a couple who had spent their own house down to nothing on one daughter and come to a wedding to take the other daughter's house to cover it. The barn understood it in pieces, and then, all at once. This wasn't a grieving mother asking a fortunate child to share. This was a family that had bankrupted itself in secret and dressed up a robbery as a funeral. And then, at the bottom of that slide, in a plain box, Elliot showed the message. The one that had surfaced unbidden on a child's tablet. The one Karen had told me we didn't even need. And we hadn't. Not for the case. But standing in that barn, I understood there was one more thing that had to see the light. Not for the law, but for the room, so that no one could ever tell my guests it had been a misunderstanding. My mother's own words to my sister, up on the screen at my wedding, in her own hand. "She was never really one of us. Once she signs, we let the bank take Ruth's house and split the cash." The barn went silent in a way that had weight to it. The pastor turned his face away. Somewhere a woman was crying, and it wasn't my mother. And I felt a small hand slip into mine, and I looked down, and it was Piper, 6 years old, frightened by the grown-up storm she didn't understand, looking up at me. I knelt down right there in my wedding dress. And I put my hand gently over her eyes so she wouldn't have to read what her grandmother had written, and I said, "Not for you, sweetheart. This part isn't for you." And I walked her, calm and careful, over to my maid of honor, who took her out into the sunshine. When I stood back up, the whole barn was looking at me, and my mother was looking at me, and for the first time in my 33 years I was not afraid of her face. I didn't need the microphone. I've learned that the quietest voice in a loud room is the one everyone strains to hear. I took my grandmother's folded letter out from where Elliot had kept it safe, and I opened it, and I read one line aloud, slow and clear, into the stillness. "This house already knows who it belongs to." Then I looked up, first at my sister, then at my father with his eyes finally lifted off the floor, and last at my mother in her funeral black, with the microphone drooping now in her gloved hand. "You didn't come here to mourn me," I said. "You came to rob me, in front of everyone I love, because you thought a crowd would make me too ashamed to say no. But I'm not the one who should be ashamed today." I let that sit. "You forged my name on my grandmother's house. You drained your own home dry for the daughter you chose, and you put on black, and called it grief, so 150 people would help you take the last thing I had left of the only person who ever chose me. I didn't shout a word of it. I didn't need to. It's all on the county record now," I said, "and now it's in front of every witness you brought yourselves." My mother's face broke, the last of the performance falling away, and what was underneath was not sorrow and not even shame. It was fury, pure and childish, the rage of someone who has always gotten her way by making a scene and has just discovered, too late, that the scene belongs to someone else now. She opened her mouth. And this time, when my mother reached for her voice, the whole room had already turned against her, and there was no version of grief left that anyone in that barn was going to believe. My mother exploded then, the way cornered people always do, and it was ugly and loud, and it convinced no one. She screamed that I was ungrateful. She screamed that I'd humiliated the family, as if she hadn't walked into a wedding in a widow's veil to do exactly that. She swung the blame around the room like a lantern, at me, at Elliot, at her own weeping description of everything she'd sacrificed, and the guests just watched her with the cold pity you feel for someone who has finally shown you who they are. Then the deputy started walking toward the front, still unhurried, and my mother saw the badge on his belt catch the string lights, and something in her animal brain finally understood that this was no longer a family fight she could win by being the loudest griever in the room. This was a barn full of witnesses, a forged deed on a 10-foot screen, and a peace officer crossing the floor. My father was already moving. He didn't say a word to me, didn't apologize, didn't even look at me. He just took my mother's elbow and started steering her toward the door, his face gray, muttering something about lawyers. And Bryn, my sister, snatched her folder off the floor and grabbed for the forged pages as if gathering up the paper could somehow unhappen the thing on the screen. And then she gave up and simply ran, her heels loud on the wooden floor, out through the string lights and the stunned guests and into the gravel lot. My mother went after her, my father after both of them, 3 figures in funeral black fleeing a wedding they'd come to turn into a grave. The barn doors banged, a car door slammed, then another. Gravel spat under tires, and then they were gone, and the only thing they left behind was the pen on the floor and the pages fluttering after them, unsigned, every one of them, because in the end, the one thing they'd come for was the one thing they never got. For a moment, the whole barn just sat there in the ringing quiet that comes after something enormous, and I stood at the front of it in my white dress, breathing, actually breathing, in a way I hadn't in weeks. Then Elliot did the kindest thing. He didn't leave the truth up there to curdle the day. He reached over and touched the laptop, and the forged deed and the money and my mother's terrible words all vanished, and in their place came the other slideshow, the real one, Elliot and me at the lake, the porch on Larkin Road, and Piper's crayon drawing of the farm with the giant yellow sun so big I could always find my way home. The pastor stood up. He walked to the front, and instead of the sermon he'd prepared, he simply said in his soft voice, "Well, I think we all know now who that young woman is, and who raised her." And he looked, not at my parents' empty chairs, but up at the drawing of the farm. Then he smiled at Elliot and me and said, "Shall we get on with celebrating a marriage?" And the barn, my barn, full of my real people, exhaled all at once and began, unbelievably, to laugh and then to clap. And then somebody near the back started the music again. My maid of honor brought Piper back in from the sunshine, and the little girl ran to me and I swung her up onto my hip, and she pointed at her own drawing glowing on the big screen and shouted, delighted, "That's my son! Aunt Willa, that's my son!" And I held my niece and my new husband's hand at the front of a barn strung with lights, and for the first time in my whole life, I was standing in a room full of family, and not one single person in it wanted anything from me except to see me happy. The rest came the way real consequences come, quietly and on paper, which is the only kind of justice that lasts. Karen filed the next week, and the forged quitclaim deed was struck from the record, void, erased, as if it had never dared to exist. The county forwarded the forgery to the district attorney, and my sister Bryn spent the following months learning what a signature can cost when it isn't yours to write. My parents' house, the one I grew up in, went the way it was always going to go once they'd emptied it out through that home equity line, into foreclosure, taken by the bank they'd been racing all along. That part I take no credit for and no pleasure in. They dug that hole themselves, one withdrawal at a time, for a daughter who ran out a barn door and left them holding it. My mother never called to apologize. Instead, there was one voicemail, weeks later, still somehow casting herself as the victim, still talking about family and loyalty and what I owed. I didn't call back. I saved it, the way I save everything now, the way my grandmother taught me. Paper doesn't forget. Neither, it turns out, do I. The farm on Larkin Road stayed mine, clean titled and unarguable, and Elliot moved his books into the room with the best morning light, and we repainted the porch together that spring, 2 gallons at a time. Some nights I still take my grandmother's green metal box down from under the stairs, not because I need anything in it, but just to sit with her letter for a minute in the quiet. This house already knows who it belongs to. It always did. It just took the rest of us a while to catch up. There was one person in that family I refused to lose, and that was Piper. None of it was ever hers. She was 6 years old, coloring a son in a notary's waiting room while the adults around her committed a crime she'll understand only when she's grown. So I did the one thing my own mother never managed to do for me. I made sure a child knew, plainly and often, that she was wanted for nothing but herself. Piper started spending Saturdays at the farm. We don't talk about the wedding, or the screen, or where her mother went when the case ran its course. We feed the chickens and we bake bad cookies and we sit on the repainted porch and watch the light go gold over the fields her great-great-grandmother worked. One afternoon she asked me, in the blunt way of children, if she'd done something wrong. I knelt down and looked her in the eye and I told her the truth, the version a child can hold. "You never owe anybody your love as payment," I said. "Not them. Not even me. You get to give it because you want to. That's the only way it counts." She thought about that with her whole serious little face, and then she nodded. And then she asked if we could go find the caterpillar named Gerald. And we did. If there's one thing I want you to carry out of this barn with me, it's this. Being the strong one in your family was never a debt you owed them your roof to repay. It was the steadiness you were quietly building all along, so that on the day they finally came for everything, you'd have the calm to keep it. That's my story. A funeral dress, a forged signature, and a screen that showed the whole room the truth they'd worn black to hide. If your family ever mistook your kindness for a door they could walk through, let this be your sign to write things down, keep your own record, and stand steady when they come. Do it today. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share this video with them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.